Hello there, and welcome to another Paro seminar. I was just explaining before the official start that I was running a little late this month because I was late for a family birthday party and it sent me out of sync. But what I want to do today is really a part two from last week, and I think I want to fill in some gaps and kind of make them of a piece. But I'll cover the material I did last week so that we kind of have that, and then I want to add a little bit more. And what I'm really interested in doing in these talks and in the future ones is try to articulate in as clear a way as possible what this work of Church of the Contradiction or transformance art or parotheology or decentering practices is, right? So these are different terms. And they all mean something slightly different, but they're basically saying the same thing. Church of the Contradiction is a type of liturgy that is designed to help invite people into kind of a certain, I'm going to talk about faith, into a kind of fidelity to a type of faith. And that's what I want to look at, particularly tonight. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about that. And by the time I finish tonight, what I'm hoping is, from the last talk and this one, there will be a really clear understanding of, a technical understanding of what knowledge is, what belief is, what faith is, and where liturgy sits. That's what I'm trying to do. So last month we looked at knowledge and belief, and I used Pascal to really dig into these terms. So I'm going to just cover that again very briefly, and then I want to add in this notion of faith. So basically what I talked about last time is that Pascal brilliantly set out to write an apologetics. And in that apologetics, the lion's share of it is he wanted the reader to experience what I'll call two types of frustration, because I'm going to introduce, I don't think I talked about this last month, I'm going to introduce the words frustration, castration, and privation in this talk that are all taken from Lacan. And these are three different ways in which we encounter lack, right? And I won't define them right now, I'll define them in a minute. But we could say that Pascal wants to help the reader experience a type of fundamental frustration, a type of knowledge. And the knowledge that Pascal is interested in the reader becoming aware of is a frustration at the level of bodily enjoyment and at the level of intellectual understanding. So he says there's a type of, to be human is to experience a crisis in certainty and satisfaction, right? Which is actually a subtitle of one of my books. I forget exactly what it was, but I think it was, something like Freeing the Tyranny of Certainty and Satisfaction. I don't know. But basically, Pascal, in a sense, is saying that we experience a lack of satisfaction in our lives and a lack of certainty. And these are primordial. One of them is the order of the body. So with the order of the body, there is a lack of satisfaction. And he talks about how basically we try to cover over the sense in which we feel that we're lacking. We feel that there is something missing. And this causes a certain misery because it feels like we've been ripped away from some primordial Eden, and we cannot fill that lack that we have. And we try all sorts of things to fulfill us, but they never do. They never seem to work, right? So you think of the neurotic who is always chasing a new job, new money, new partner, and they never seem to be able to be satisfied. What is called the objet petit a, which for the neurotic is something that can never be grasped. It's a type of non-existent object that you're always seeking, and every time you get something, it's not that. Every time you get what you think you want, it's not quite right? So that's the sense of being dissatisfied. And Pascal writes beautifully on that, and he talks about how we engage in what he calls divertisement, to try to avoid a confrontation with this lack of satisfaction that is existential. So that's the order of the body. Pascal says we ultimately are dissatisfied. We hide it from ourselves, and we can be very good at hiding it from ourselves. And he kind of says that his kind of patron saint of the order of the body, the one who does this best, is royalty. Right? Because in royalty, they have enough money to employ lots of distractions. And so today we might say the patron saint of the order of the body is a rock star or an actor. It's not that they are less miserable, Pascal would say, but they have more money and resources to hide from it. So, if you're in LA or New York and you're going to all the parties and your access to drugs and sex and commodities, you can hide from the misery. But as Søren Kierkegaard would say, it's not that you're not miserable, you just don't know you're miserable. Right? The despair of not knowing you're in despair. And Pascal wants to reveal that. So that's what he does at the order of the body. And then at the order of the mind, Pascal wants you to come to the realization that when it comes to the big questions in life about the cosmos, the absolute, meaning, ethics, etc., we can never land on certainty. Right? There's people who are smarter than us who think something different than us. Right? There seems to be small things that we can seem to get some sort of understanding of, but the big questions seem to elude us. And I say it's not that, and the whole thing about Pascal is we can talk about probabilities and possibilities. So there is some acquisition of understanding, but knowledge escapes us. So he draws this out, and you, the reader, if you read Pensée and you're like, and you feel it, you're kind of going, you're put into this place of going, oh yeah, I want certainty and satisfaction, and they seem to be so elusive. That's the knowledge, right? In Pascal's work, that's what we know. We know that we aren't happy, and we know that we don't know the answers, right? So that's knowledge. And in the last seminar, I talked about how this is very important in relation to psychoanalysis. It's, Pascal is a proto-existentialist, which means that in Pascal, you see lots of themes that are then later taken up by the existentialist thinkers. And this is one of the things that is proto-existentialist. This idea that we're thrown into a world where we don't know what we ought to do, but still we have to act, and where we feel alienation. We feel that we are missing something, meaninglessness in the modern existential sense of the term. So you get this in Pascal, in Pensée. It's not the only reason why he's a proto-existentialist, but you start to see these existential themes in Pascal. So the reason why I connect that with psychoanalysis is because in psychoanalysis, the knowledge that the infant gets, the thing that we know when we're an infant, is that we know that there is lack. And the first lack is frustration. We're fed and then we're not. We can sometimes be comforted and sometimes we're not. There's this frustration because there's something we want and need that is not always there, right? And so all of us encounter and experience frustration, right? Then I'm going to just cover this very briefly. Then there is what's called castration. Castration, in a sense, is the name for encountering the fact that the other is lacking, that the other has desires, and we're one of those desires, but we're not the only thing they desire. They also desire other things. And we kind of confront that this person who is like an omnipotent God, all-powerful God, who has the power to give and to withhold, themselves is frustrated, and that's called castration. And then finally, privation is the name for the realization that this is not some contingent reality that can be overcome, but is fundamental, right? Ontological in philosophy. So frustration, castration, privation. We might come back to that. I talked about that in Coffee and Concepts a few weeks ago, and I'll maybe do some more on those three ideas. I did a podcast with Shizek and so on, the podcast called Shizek and so on, where I talk about that as well, so you could check that out. But in our infancy, the thing that we know is we know that there is privation, there is lack, and that marks us from the very beginning, right? In psychoanalysis proper, this is the fundamental insight. And I think I connected it with the academic world and the scientific world, right? So what I argued, at least I argued in Coffee and Concepts, if not the last seminar, is that if you look at the growth of the sciences in the broad sense of that term, the fundamental insight that they all come to at some point is the insight that there is something that cannot be grasped, and not because of a lack of knowledge, but because of an excess of knowledge. The clearest example of that is Gödel's incompleteness theorem in mathematics, that shows that a sufficiently large logical mathematical system can be, there's something that can be true but not provable. There is a sense in which there's something within that logical system that defies grasp. But you also see this in quantum mechanics, with the idea of a kind of a non-determinacy within kind of the scientific, within physics itself. But you also see this, the name for this in politics is democracy, and the name for it in psychoanalysis is the unconscious, the non-at-oneness of consciousness with itself. But so it's interesting. I want to make that link between kind of like what the infant discovers, knowledge that there's something we do not know, which is what Pascal talks about, with the scientific enterprise, which is that we come to realize that there is something that we know we don't know, right? Now, within Pascal, you have knowledge, which is knowledge of lack. Right? Then, at the order of what he calls the heart, he talks about this sense of a certainty and a satisfaction that cannot be gained from the order of the body and the order of the mind. So remember, the order of the body is satisfaction. We can't get satisfaction. We're always dissatisfied. At the order of the mind, we can't get certainty, right? We want certainty with the big questions, but we're left with probability, we're left with uncertainty. Right? So that's knowledge of a lack of satisfaction, a lack of certainty. Belief is a type of nevertheless, I act as if there is certainty and satisfaction. And I use perversion to talk about this because in the perverse structure, there is what's called disavowal. I know that something is lacking, nevertheless, I act as if it isn't. And I use the example of, somebody who might go, I know that astrology will not tell me who I should go out with. Nevertheless, I act as if it does, right? So I know the commodity won't bring a lasting satisfaction. Nevertheless, I work so hard to get money to buy some product, knowing that it won't satisfy me, and yet somehow still believing that it will. So knowledge is knowledge of a type of lack, and belief is this refusal to embrace that knowledge. Right? Belief is, and I say Pascal says, he calls it the order of the heart, where you have a sense of a certainty that the mind cannot give you, and a satisfaction that bodily objects cannot give you. And faith, and this is the key thing for this talk, faith is what holds the contradiction together. And this is very key. So I want to give it this is a technical definition of faith, which is living the contradiction. Living the contradiction. And there's various ways you can understand this, but I think and I didn't get a chance to look it up because I was running late, but in Hebrews there's a verse that talks about faith is, certainty of what you do not know, and seeing what cannot be seen, something like that. But you see, faith is defined as the holding together of a contradiction, the living of a contradiction. And actually, Søren Kierkegaard, in Fear and Trembling, he basically argues for this. He says, Abraham is the father of faith, and Abraham is marked by holding together a contradiction, believing that he will kill his son, and yet somehow will retain his son as the kind of seed out of which the people will arise. So Kierkegaard, and this is very different from this very popular Jungian approach to the Bible that you see in someone like Jordan Peterson these days, where the Bible is a book of wisdom, and you read it and you find rules for life, ways to live. Søren Kierkegaard would hate that, right? Because for him, the Bible and Jesus are not wise and not ethical, right? You can't build rules for life out of stories like Abraham and Isaac, right? And that's Kierkegaard's whole point in Fear and Trembling, is like, you cannot make a moral position out of that, right? Telling someone to go and kill their kid because they hear a voice, right? But what Kierkegaard brings out is this idea of somehow faith is living a contradiction. And that's what I want to draw out with the work that I'm doing. But it's different from Pascal, very different from Pascal. Because in the last talk I said that Pascal has ultimately got a form of perversion, where you have knowledge that there is a lack of certainty and satisfaction. You have belief that there is a certainty and a satisfaction. And faith is what holds those together through the liturgy, through religious practice. Religious practice is the manifestation of an act that holds knowledge and belief together. So that, now for Pascal, people do religious practices for all kinds of bad reasons, but if you're doing it in good faith, Pascal says you're either doing it because you want faith or because you're living in fidelity to a faith. Right, that's this kind of thing. Religious practice is either, you would love to have faith, and so you do these religious practices, or you have experienced faith, and religious practice is how you're faithful to that, how you live that out. So religious practice becomes basically a fetish, because that's how a perverse subject holds together knowledge and belief through a fetish object. Strange as it sounds, Freud's initial insights into fetishism is you realize the other is castrated, does not have everything, and the fetish object is what prevents you from feeling that knowledge. It's what prevents you from experiencing the trauma of seeing the other as divided. That's kind of what the fetish object is. So in religion, the fetish object is what prevents you from experiencing a life of deep unknowing, doubt, complexity, and ambiguity. As long as you have the religious practice, you somehow can have doubt and unknowing, but not experience the horror of it, like a child having a security blanket, knowing that they're in a room full of people, but not experiencing the existential fear of being in a room full of adults because they've got the security blanket. Right? The security blanket is a fetish object that prevents the child from experiencing the truth that they know, the knowledge that they have. But of course, becoming an adult is getting rid of this transitional object, beginning to be able to live into this lack rather than protecting yourself eternally against it. So, taking in this idea that the word faith, taking it out of a confessional religious environment, just going, what does the word faith define? You're like, it defines a type of living of a contradiction. And what does that look like in terms of radical theology, in terms of Church of the Contradiction? And I want to say it like this, okay? That the work that we've been doing here, and I've been doing in various seminars, has been exploring the idea that the lack of certainty and satisfaction is not contingent. It's not something you lost and will be able to get back, like the idea in some therapies that there's a pre-traumatic subject, you have a trauma and you can kind of overcome the trauma, right? But that there is no pre-traumatic subject. that to be a human being is to be marked by a certain dissatisfaction and lack of certainty. Right? However, the deeper you go into that lack, the more intractable it becomes. And this is where I want to go back to what I mentioned about frustration, castration, and privation, because you can think of these as increasingly intractable forms of lack. So frustration is the easiest one. We all get frustrated, and we can get over that frustration. The infant who is hungry and feels frustrated because they aren't being fed can be fed, right? The second level, the more intractable lack, is when you realize that the other is lacking, that this other is a desiring subject, and to desire means you do not have. There's something that you're missing, because to desire is to want, right? So the other is a desiring subject. So this frustration is not simply something that you feel, it's in the other, right? And that's quite traumatic, this frustration. And then finally, there is the acknowledgement of privation, which is that this cannot be overcome. This is something what's called real. So for any Lacanians among you, frustration is at the level of what's called the imaginary, castration at the level of the symbolic, and privation at the level of the real. And now, all these problems arise because whether you're neurotic, perverse, or psychotic, generally what that means is that in some way you are either refusing the knowledge or you're rebelling against it, right? So I won't go into details about that, but each is almost like a different form of rebellion against this knowledge. Right? And a lot of psychoanalysis is about helping you come to know what you know, but don't want to know, right? To come to know what you know, but don't want to know. What do you know? That lack is through everything. And that's what you do not want to know at some level. And analysis can help you to come to live into that lack rather than shore up defenses against it, which cause all sorts of problems because we get libidinally invested in frenetic pursuits of certainty and satisfaction. And you could say the entire libidinal economy of contemporary society is related to the attempt to overcome our dissatisfaction and our lack of certainty. Now, when you embrace the depth of this insight, what you realize is that there is a satisfaction to dissatisfaction, and there is a certainty to uncertainty. I'm going to give some concrete examples to this, but one of the psychoanalytic insights is that we actually, and this is where I differentiate from Pascal, is that we enjoy our lack of enjoyment. To be human is not just to want to fulfill our desires, but to also sustain our desire, to sustain a level of longing, of want, of sacrifice. We consciously think we want to get over sacrifice, we want to overcome lack, and we want to get rid of desire with the object. But actually, we get something out of our desirousness, out of our struggle. And I was thinking about this in relation to somebody who gets married. And, marriage is, to some extent, for a lot of people, marriage is a way of acknowledging the mundane, right? Because when you get married, you kind of cut off all of these other options that you might have had. You settle with one person generally, if if it's monogamous, and you kind of like build a life. There's something difficult about that. Of course there is, something very difficult. I think it can be incredibly beautiful, but it's kind of very, it can be, the happiest time of someone's life is getting married, but at the same time, there are these struggles with marriage. And one of the things that happens is sometimes you go and you will talk to your friends about how much your partner annoys you, right? So you'll go and you'll bitch about them, right? Well, What is that activity? Well, in a way, that's an activity in which you're enjoying your lack of enjoyment, right? It's a way of squeezing enjoyment out of what you don't enjoy, symbolizing the lack of enjoyment and turning it into something enjoyable, right? So in a way, you're enjoying your lack of enjoyment. And in a healthy marriage, you could say that there is a way in which you can symbolize the struggles and enjoy the struggles, either symbolize them with your friends or and hopefully with your partner in different ways. So that's just an example of how you can enjoy what you don't enjoy. But we don't realize this consciously. Consciously, we don't see that we are getting something out of our struggles, the struggles that we're in, right? So weirdly, at the order of the body, we are satisfied in our dissatisfaction. But the problem is we don't acknowledge that, we don't realize it, and as a result, it becomes destructive in our lives. Right? And at the same time, in terms of the order of the mind, I just mentioned it with like Gödel's incompleteness theorem and with Niels Bohr, and in terms of the insights of superpositioning, wave particle duality. We can come to know something that we don't know. We come to know that there is something inherently unpredictable, novel, or spontaneous at the deepest level of reality. Again, this is different from Pascal, because Pascal is saying we don't know, but there is knowledge. There is a way in which if we had the mind of God, we would know everything, right? And if we never, I suppose, fail, we would never have felt this incompleteness. But in this other idea is that no, to be human is to experience a lack of certainty and a lack of satisfaction. But when that is embraced and gone to the deepest level, we realize that there's a certain satisfaction in dissatisfaction and a certain certainty in uncertainty. Right? I mean, even Thomas Aquinas talked about the ignorance that comes from not reading and not thinking, and the ignorance that comes from a life of reading and thinking. They're two different things, right? And what he's pointing to in the latter is there is a type of unknowing that comes not from a lack of knowledge, but an excess. Now, if you take that as accurate, then faith is enjoying and living these contradictions. Faith is a way in which you can enjoy your lack of enjoyment, and you can find a type of certainty in the uncertainty. And it's not an intellectual thing, it is a form of life. And the liturgy is designed to invite you into that experience of faith. And how the liturgy does that is through music and art and poetry, in which doubt, ambiguity, and unknowingness is symbolized, put into art, put into words, put into comedy, put into cabaret, put into sermons, put into parables. And of course, the very image of the crucified Christ, which is a God who is wounded, a God who is not whole and complete, right? That very image kind of draws us experientially into this insight. Even the notion of the passion of the Christ. Passion as a word that brings together immense suffering and enjoyment. The word passion, weirdly, is a term that brings together a contradiction. And so you're invited into an embrace, a living of the passion, a living of the contradiction. And this is an emancipatory event. And so radical theology, parotheology, is different from confessional theology, because in the last seminar, I basically argued that confessional liturgies can often, not always, but confessional liturgies can be a type of fetish that allow you to, have doubts and unknowing, maybe intellectually, and yet nevertheless kind of believe in wholeness and completeness, a oneness, a unity of everything. Whereas in Church of the Contradiction, the ritual is designed to not bring you away from your knowledge, but to redouble it, to bring frustration through castration to privation, to help you encounter a type of contradiction in knowledge and a contradiction in a contradiction in certainty and a contradiction in satisfaction, and an ability to embrace that, to live it, to enjoy it, to allow it to do its work within you. This is a different form of being in the world. Okay, so that's basically what I want to say. I'll try and now sum it up in a few minutes. If any of you have any questions, type them into the chat box. But what I'm arguing, in a nutshell, because a lot of people talk about knowledge and belief, but they don't, and faith, these three terms, but we don't really define what they are. I'm trying to define them in very, very precise ways, so as you can see, again, what this work is about and what I'm inviting you into, because this doesn't exist yet. So we need some of you to create these spaces. So knowledge is a particular type of knowledge. It is a knowledge of not knowing. It is a knowledge of a lack of, it is not, well, it's on two levels. It's at the level of certainty that we don't know, and at the level of satisfaction that there's a lack of satisfaction. So that's knowledge, that we lack certainty and satisfaction. That's the knowledge. Belief is where you say, nevertheless, I live as though there is certainty and satisfaction. Right. So that's that. The fetish object, religious belief, religious practice, is what allows this disavowal, so that you can say, I know that I lack certainty and satisfaction, nevertheless I believe in certainty and satisfaction through the religious ritual, the fetish, and that is faith, living that contradiction. But that for me is infantile faith. That's not true faith. If I had the hour before this talk, I would have a better term for it, but let me call it an imitation faith, right? Because faith is all about contradiction. But instead what I'm arguing is that the proper idea is that at the level of knowledge, when we go all the way, we realize that we have certainty that we're not certain, and we can get satisfaction out of our lack of satisfaction. Those are things that are always going on. And faith is what allows us to embrace that truth, embrace that reality, and live into that reality. And religious liturgy, practice, say cabaret, comedy, storytelling, music, and whatever, ritual, allows us to kind of put into a type of artistic form that reality that we introject, we bring into ourselves, and that helps us live the contradiction. And that's the life of faith, to live the contradiction. In fact, my old logo of Pyrotheology says, there's a famous phrase by Tertullian. He didn't quite say this, but he basically said, I believe in Christ because it is absurd. Right? I believe in the death of Christ because it is absurd. And a lot of people have rejected this, right? So religious believers reject it because they say, I believe in Christ because it's not absurd. And some atheists will say, I don't believe because it is absurd, right? But whereas Tertullian says, I do believe because it's absurd. And I changed that to say, I have faith in the absurd. I have faith because it's absurd. And what that means, because absurdity, for Albert Camus, absurdity is living a contradiction. And in his way of describing it is, the world seems to lack meaning, and we want meaning. So we as meaning-desiring beings confront a universe that resists meaning, and we have to live in the absurd of these contradictions. So when I say have faith in the absurd, what I'm arguing for is a religion of the absurd, a faith in the absurd, which is where we live in and enjoy and find emancipation in a type of embrace of these contradictions. And it's not an intellectual endeavor. It is one that requires liturgy, it requires art. It is not, otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this otherwise. But it requires people like Nick Cave putting into words the contradiction so that when we listen to Nick Cave, we find ourselves being invited into living that ourselves. Okay, I hope that's clear. Knowledge, belief, faith, religious practice, non-fetishistic religious practice is moving you into this profound sense of the life of faith. All right. And somebody I see just mentioned Mick Jagger, which is very good because, I did the same thing with the camera. Yes, I can't get no satisfaction. I guess you're mentioning that. Okay, let me see. Jeff says, could you say a little more about the link with democracy? Sounds super. Yeah, so democracy, in a sense, is the name for the non-oneness of the social body that generates civilization. So no, and that's under threat. And I don't mean that in the way people talk about it. But I mean, what's under threat is we find it more and more difficult to talk to people who think differently to us. I've talked about this before, but what Todd McGowan calls the commons. So community is where you have like-minded people who think the same as you, have the same beliefs, the same enemies, right? So that's community. We all have communities. And then we have the commons, which is like a public park or a public bus, where you literally can meet people who think radically different to you. And you have to, in a sense, share this space with people who you may find deeply offensive. That's the commons. And then I talk about communion, which is, as I said, I'd done a talk a few months ago about that. You can look it up. But one of the reasons why Todd loves Speed, the original Speed movie, and his reading of it's brilliant. He basically says that what works in Speed is it happens on a bus, a type of commons, where there are all these different type of people, some of whom you wouldn't want to be on a bus with, right? And they all have to find a way to work together. Whereas Speed 2 is on a luxury cruise liner and it completely doesn't work because it's not a commons, right? So there's something about the commons that's deeply important. And for democracy works precisely because we're not a community. Because there can never be a positive identity that unifies us all. That's an impossibility. As Todd McGowan says, all communities are gated. All communities have insiders and outsiders. That's the way it is. Good communities, bad communities, they all have insiders and outsiders. But democracy, it works because its society is made of people who think radically different things. And if democracy is to work well, it's, in a sense, it's able to use those differences to generate arguments and what's called not antagonism but agonism, to turn antagonism into agonism, or war into conflict. War is the inability to have conflict. In war you want to destroy the other. Conflict is where you stay in the back and forth. So that's so democracy can be seen as one of the earliest examples in political science of coming to grips with the non-oneness of the social organism. The social organism is not at one with itself, which generates civilization and its discontents. Somebody said, I wonder if absurd is better than contradiction, Kierkegaard's notion of faith by nature of the absurd. That's very good. I bet you said that before I talked about the absurd, so I agree with you, obviously, because I brought that in. And actually, I might do a talk on the absurd, because I really like that phrase. Very, very important in existentialism. I think the absurdity is very, very good. Oh, yes, and you said it. Yeah, so great minds think alike. Is that Luke? Okay, the absurd is that the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of the world. Yeah, I mean, that's a type of exactly contradiction. This way, I mean, Christianity, one of the reasons why people like Zizek and McGowan and myself and others and Hegel are interested, not that I'm putting myself in the same bracket as them, or Hegel especially, but is it because it's full of contradictions, the highest and the lowest. God, he can't die, dying, all that, all these contradictions that are in this cruciform event. It's very dialectical. Is there a distinction between faith in a contradiction and faith in contradiction in itself? Must faith be connected to a singular contradiction? Oh, that's very good. Is there a distinction between faith in a contradiction and faith in contradiction itself. Yes. If I understand you rightly, what I'm trying to argue is that faith is not what the physicist is doing when they're talking about wave particle duality, or the political theorist is doing when they're talking about democracy, or the biologist is doing talking about evolution, because evolution is the name of the non-at-oneness and biological life or whatever. These are all very interesting, very important, and they all fit. But faith is that contradiction at its most basic. That's why I think the death of God is the most basic contradiction. And all of these other insights come from it. Because the death of God is the contradiction at the heart of the absolute itself. So yeah, I think that's a really way to say, you find contradictions. And Paul Tillich argued a structural form of this in his book, My Search for Absolutes. He's doing something different from me, but he kind of says that in a way, or if I use the argument, the way I, in my own words, this is, you go like, philosophers, political theorists, biologists, physicists, logicians are wrestling ultimately with dialectics in their given fields. But for me, faith is living the contradiction existentially as such. And you don't have to have any knowledge of physics or biology or any of these sciences to live in that contradiction. Faith is kind of fundamentally living that contradiction. And that's why I think it's close to psychoanalysis, because I think that's partly what the cure looks like for within psychoanalysis. Let's see. Courtney says, question, on the one hand, I know that person A has more knowledge training than I have, therefore they can help me in something where I can't help myself. On the other hand, is this any different from believing that person A has some mystical knowing I don't have? So I'm hoping this person can fix the lack I'm experiencing. Okay, yes. So Courtney says, you know, like if you think of like, on the one hand, you know that somebody, say a doctor, has more knowledge and training in biology than you have, and so can maybe help you in healing in a way that you can't. Is that any different from believing that that doctor has some mystical knowing? And I would say yes. I'd say this is an important difference. And this is about what's called transference. Is there are people who know more than you. I go on YouTube all the time and learn stuff about things I know nothing about. I really enjoy going to random rabbit holes. There's people who know more than you, but it's not a mystical knowing. You don't go, oh, they somehow have some deep insight. There is. So in psychoanalysis, you go to the analyst and you might think, oh, they're an expert, like a doctor, and they have some training, which they do, that will help me come to see something in myself that I cannot see, right? That's why you go to analysis, to see your hidden enjoyments, repetitions, all of that. That's not where the real meat happens in analysis. It's when you think that they have not just an expertise, but they can they know things about you that you do not know. Like they become a stand-in for your unknown desires. So I say to the analyst, I know what you're thinking. And then you say something and you go, okay, that's what I'm thinking. I had a friend just recently who didn't want to go and see a family member. There's an estrangement. They didn't want to go and see a family member, but they said that they were really sad because their kids would not get to see that family member, and their kids would grow up not knowing that family member. And now, this might not be completely true, but as we talked, I was like, well, in a way, I think that's how you feel. I think you consciously don't want to see that family member, but but unconsciously you do. You want to see them, you want to be reconciled with them, but you've put that knowledge onto your children because your kids don't care. They don't know this person from Adam, right? So what you think your kids are thinking is potentially a projection or a transference of a projection of what you're thinking, but you cannot come to admit to yourself, going, I don't want to see that person. I've no interest in seeing them. Well, you're projecting that desire externally to you. Now, what an analyst does is an analyst. You do that to the analyst. You project onto the analyst what you're thinking, but cannot admit to yourself. And then the analyst can very subtly help you see that that's what you think. Those are two different types. There's one is where someone's just an expert who knows more than you. The other is they are the stand-in for your hidden desire. They become kind of like, you think that they can see things that you can't, but really what they're doing is they're just reflecting a mirror back so that you can see something in yourself. I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but it's the latter. And that's very important in analysis. You have to start by doing that and then ultimately realize that it's you that's doing the work, not the other. Right? That's why I talk about the last guru. The last guru is the one you project onto the guru all the answers, and then you realize if they're good at their job, that they're just helping you do the work yourself. Okay, question from Bill. Can you please say more about the satisfaction of knowing all is incomplete? Is this related to McGowan and Lacan's theory of satisfaction? Maybe a concrete example if possible. Thank you, Bill. Absolutely. I'm kind of using Pascal's framework a little bit here, because I think he says it very beautifully, very similar to analysis, that there's really two senses of knowledge, one at the level of the body and the other at the level of the mind. At the level of the body, you feel dissatisfaction at the level of the body, and at the level of the mind, a lack of certainty. And in psychoanalysis, one is the imaginary, one's the symbolic. So the imaginary level is the image of perfection, wholeness, completeness. You can look at somebody that you think is everything, a pop star or something, someone who has it all. And then at the level of the symbolic, you try to name something. I'm doing this talk right now, trying to articulate something, but I always miss it. There's always something that's missing. So that's similar to what Pascal is saying. At the level of the body, there is a sense in which we're missing something, and that's called objet petit a. And at the level of the signifier, at the level of language, at the level of concepts in the mind, there's always something missing. You can never quite articulate what you want to articulate. You can never quite say what you want to say, right? So those are these two experiences. But then what psychoanalysis brings to that is they say, but it's not as simple as there's no satisfaction and there's no certainty. There is, as I say, there is an enjoyment in your lack of enjoyment. And the concrete example I used is talking about your partner behind their back to your friends, where you're kind of the whatever the problem is in the relationship, you're kind of enjoying it, and that's not bad. I'm kind of arguing that. I mean, it can be bad, but going like it's not. It can be a good thing to be able to kind of say things about your partner, so as to kind of enjoy your lack of enjoyment. But we're always doing that. If someone can't write a book, it's not that they're not doing what they enjoy. There's something they're getting out of not writing. There's some enjoyment that might be from the fantasy of writing the book, which would be gone if you wrote the book. So you can have the fantasy of how amazing it would be if you wrote the book. You can be lost in fantasy, and so if you ever wrote the book, you would lose the thing that you really like, which is the fantasy, etc., etc. So that's the interesting thing that psychoanalysis says is we get satisfaction from our lack of satisfaction, but the problem is we don't realize that, and there is a certainty of uncertainty. There's a type of we can know that we don't know. It's not just we don't know, we can know that we don't know at a very deep level. And that's what Hegel argued very fundamentally. That's the whole of Hegel's philosophy in a nutshell, I would say. I don't know if that clarified anything, but it's very good. Bill then says, sorry, I tend to view it as satisfying because we know nothing is certain, but that's satisfying. Okay, because you're talking about, is there satisfaction in a lack of knowing? And there's an intellectual satisfaction, and Pascal talks about that, but I would say it's the difference, as I say, between not knowing something because you lack the knowledge and knowing that there is an element to reality that is spontaneous. And you have this in Whitehead as well, and Deleuze, I think, and others, that this is why I'm not a determinist. There is a dimension to reality that is unknowable in itself. In fact, the working title of my book, one of them, I've got about 3 working titles, is The Unknowing God. Instead of the unknown God, the unknowing God, which is the idea that the absolute doesn't know, which is kind of a metaphor. Raoul, good to see you, man. Bill saying, just wanting to hear you explain how you're using satisfaction. Hopefully, that clarified that. Thank you, man. And then Luke says, the God of your own understanding is the God of contradiction, in contrast to the God of confessionalism and objectivism. The God of your own understanding is the God of contradiction, in contrast to the God of confessional objectivism. I have to think about that, Luke. You always say very interesting things. I need to unpack that a little bit. But those questions, I think that's all the questions. As I say, I'm very sorry that I was running late because of this family party, and maybe it was a little bit more all over the place than usual. And hey, I'm always all over the place. But I'm going to use a closing example of that, which I used to use when I gave live talks. I used to give live talks. I wish I could get back to that again. That would be fun. But I kind of realized that lots of people would say is when I gave live talks, I would talk quickly. I'd use my hands. I'd be going all over the place. I would go off in tangents. And people would say to me, Peter, you would be a great public speaker if only you could slow down a little bit, not go off on all those tangents, right? And I remember at the time going, oh, no, this is great. Because at the moment you've got a fantasy that I could be a great speaker if I did those things. If I did those things, I would be a crap speaker. So now I'm a crap speaker, but with the fantasy that I'm a good speaker, right? So the problem in the speaking is actually what made me an okay speaker, because people were there enjoying the fantasy that I could be really good if I just did those things. But if I did those things, I'd sound like a TED Talk, and then that would be horrific. I would never want to sound like a TED Talk. All right. There's Kate with one final question. Brilliant. Can talking about your partner also be framed as the limited, permitted rebellion that keeps the entire system intact? 100%. What Kate's referencing there is very good. So whenever I use these examples, I'm often using them kind of as neither good nor bad in themselves, because they can operate differently. So what Kate's referencing there is sometimes you can be in a bad relationship, like a relationship that maybe should come to an end. But you find all of these gas release valves that as long as you can go away for a bit, as long as you can talk about it with other people, that actually keeps you in the relationship. So that talking isn't just kind of a healthy way of enjoying your lack of enjoyment, but it actually keeps you in something that needs to change. And I think that's absolutely right. And it's sometimes very hard to know which is which, because as I've talked about previously, it's not the idea that there's relationships that work and there's relationships that don't work. There's relationships that don't work in a way that works, and relationships that don't work in a way that doesn't, right? So it's the same. I've talked about it within capitalism. People say, oh, capitalism works because it generates, say, innovation or efficiency, or it generates less poverty over time for more people. And then there's people who say it doesn't work, generates recessions, depressions, it's not efficient, etc., creates alienation. But I think the real psychoanalytic insight is it works because it doesn't. It works because it doesn't give you what you want. There's a great term in analysis called, I think it's apophansis. I need to look it up. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to use a Greek word and I can't quite remember what it is. Apophansis. Anyway, what it means is disappearing. If anybody knows it, stick it in there. But it kind of means that it's this weird thing where you disappear when you get what you desire. It's a form of disappearance that whenever something works. So whenever a star, or somebody who wants to be a star, gets to be in the first big movie and they crash and burn, because in getting what they want, they disappear as a subject because their subjectivity is caught up precisely in not getting what you want. There's something about capitalism where it kind of functions because it really doesn't give you what you want. It gives a few people what they want, and that causes its own disaster for those people, right? And you see that today where a lot of big stars are returning to, the trad revival because they got everything they wanted and it didn't work, right? So are you in a relationship that doesn't work in the right way, or are you in a relationship that doesn't work in the wrong way? If your relationship worked, it would be boring, right? So anyway, thank you. And there's a comment I'll read from Courtney. Not all over the place, at least not any more than for migraine. Thank you, Courtney. Anyway, so I do hope You don't delete it. I won't. Thank you. For one thing, I'll want to re-listen to your answers to my questions. Courtney, thank you so much. And always, Courtney, thank you so much for being part of this collective for the last couple of years or more. Actually, it's probably been. So I've come to know a lot of you personally, and that's been a very enriching part of my life. So thank you. Okay, appreciate you checking in. Have a great day or night wherever you are in the world. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.